All right, so let's start talking. I'm going to focus on Everett because he's much more handsome than I am. And he's also very productive. You see, he's helping me clean out the new workshop where I intend to build airships. So if you're watching this video, maybe you're looking at the Indiegogo or looking at my Facebook or something of that nature. But I do intend to, in fact, build airships. At first, very small scale models. Multiple scale models, and then eventually scaling up. You gonna say hi? Yeah, you got a broom. Yeah, the stairs. The stairs go up there. That's true. There's actually an upstairs to this workshop. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm building airships, or why I want to build airships. What my idea is. Basically, I feel there's an obvious progression to human transportation. From walking to riding animals to later building vehicles like the kind we drive around so frequently right now. And airplanes have been around and airships have been around actually a little bit longer than airplanes, but flying vehicles have been around for about 100 years now, a little bit more maybe. And it's discouraging to me that we as a species haven't moved on to that type of transportation full time, or at least more commonly. It seems like we should be flying more than driving these days. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to build airships. The other reason is because about, 80 years ago, in the 20s and 30s, we had incredible flying airships with incredible capabilities, including the ability to house many people in luxury and fly around the whole world, including over the poles and across the Pacific and across the Atlantic in every direction they wanted to go. But now we actually have technology. We could make airships much superior to the ones that were around in the 20s and 30s. One of the great improvements that we have now is GPS navigation, GPS satellites, and the computers that can recognize that information and plot your location, not just your location latitude and longitude wise, but also elevation as well, which is a tool we certainly didn't have back then. In fact, when the airships were around, and most of the airship disasters that happened back then were due to the fact that they didn't have a good altimeter. They didn't have a good altimeter until much later. I think the altimeter that we still use today was developed shortly before World War II, or maybe during World War II as a result of the war. But at the time of the airships, they were using barometers as an altimeter. So it's no wonder that so many of them crashed into the ocean and all that sort of thing. Also, they didn't build numerous airships. They just built one here and one there. If they would have built 100 of the same model and kept trying to improve it slowly and surely, I think it would have gotten a lot better with time. Instead, they just built, a few very large airships and crashed them, usually with a lot of people, in a form of great tragedy. Obviously, the Hindenburg's a famous one everybody talks about. But the Hindenburg, it's important to address that because the Hindenburg was actually covered with thermite, rocket fuel, and gunpowder, loosely translated into layman's terms. That was very roughly what the Hindenburg was covered in. So if people marvel at the explosion in the Hindenburg and the disaster and the calamity, and actually it's a wonder it didn't blow up sooner, considering what it was painted with. I mean, those are some extremely reactive compounds. And if you know anything about thermite, you know that's where the fireball came from, the inferno, and most of the tragedy actually came from that. Mythbusters did a great episode about the Hindenburg disaster, and they tried to recreate it on scale model. I think they did a really, really good job, and they pretty much pinpointed exactly what the problem was, which was what it was covered with. One of the other great technologies we have now, besides, knowing not to cover your airship in 3 different kinds of combustible materials, is much lighter materials. At the time when airships were prevalent, they were primarily made with duralumin, which is kind of an aluminum compound, and and it's a good compound for aeronautical purposes. It has some good properties, but I think we could do a lot better now with carbon fiber and even some other metallic alloys, and even ABS plastic is something they didn't have when they were building airships the first time. So that's something to consider. Some of the other great commodity hardware we have now is Android phones. I mean, computers and everything that's gone on in that progression. I do IT for a living, so I'm intimately familiar with that. So if you watch, if you watch the progression of technology as I have since I got into IT about 15 years ago, you see that's not slowing down at all. If anything, it's increasing in speed as we continue to follow Moore's law of double the transistors for half the price every couple of years, or whatever the technical details of Moore's law is. And now, everybody has a supercomputer by 80s standards, certainly a supercomputer in their pocket in the form of an Android phone. According to this video right now on an Android phone, there's 8 core Android phones that are on the market now. So that even eclipses most of the desktops that people were using even 3 or 4 years ago. So, and now, you can get a used Android phone for $60, and that has all the necessary computer hardware to completely navigate an airship. Not just to navigate an airship, but also to handle all of its communications infrastructure, its ability to communicate with other airships, and plot courses that would avoid any kind of collision or anything like that. All automated. That's the plan, is to make these airships automated. Google's trying to make cars automated right now, and that's a lofty goal. It's actually really hard to automate vehicles. They have to follow all kinds of traffic rules, and they have to be aware of pedestrians, and just there's a whole range of things that go into programming autonomous car that make it a very difficult task, which is one of the reasons why they have so many competitions between upper level engineering schools to perform that task. An autonomous airship would actually be much easier to design and operate safely. For one, you've got 3 dimensions instead of 2, and 99.99% of those 3 dimensions is empty space. So as long as they avoid each other and stay out of the flight path of commercial airlines and airports, that's pretty much it. That's all the navigation you need. You need to know where you are, where you're going, and what to avoid. And what to avoid becomes much easier once you get off the ground. Although, props to Google for attempting to make autonomous cars, because that's a huge difficult task. I talked a little bit a moment ago about the failings of the early airship industry, and certainly their inability to build numerous small models and instead focus on large models was a huge problem. A big part of the early airship industry problem too was, of course, they were trying to use airships for military purposes. The Germans actually did use airships for military purposes in both the World Wars, as did the Allies and other people, but certainly the Germans had the most success. If you could call it success. An airship makes a horrible military weapon, which is another reason why we don't have airships now. There's very little funding for sky blue projects like that, especially when they don't make a good weapon, and certainly we've seen that if it can't be weaponized, it's not going to be produced by most of the governments of the world, which most of the governments of the world are the people who have the deep pockets, or the organizations that have the deep pockets to fund those kind of projects, those kind of expensive projects. So again, a big part of my project would be to create many small, inexpensive models and do just a whole lot of testing per model. I plan on having, maybe 50 different iterations of small models before I ever even consider building a full-size one that you could ride in. And the great thing is there's a lot of utility to a smaller model airship. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently is how to make that viable and useful today, and autonomous presence is a huge one. If you had an airship that could fly anywhere in the world, even if it was only, 4 feet long or something like that, you could effectively show up and begin Skyping with anybody on location anywhere in the world. And I think that could be very useful for a variety of purposes, particularly security. If you're able to patrol large areas from the comfort of your desk via remote presence, just picture yourself as the face on the front of an airship hooked up to a constant, Skype type conversation. Although obviously I'd want to get away from Skype. It doesn't. It works, but I find it's got a host of problems, and I use Skype almost every day, so I'm familiar with them. The other big motivator for me in airships is freedom, complete and total freedom. The original aviator who developed actually most of what we know as far as design goes of airplanes and airships, his name was Alberto Santos Dumont, and he's not a very famous historical figure. He is in Brazil, which is where he was born, and he is a little bit in France, which is where he chose to live for most of his life. And he certainly is, if you know anything about airships, but other than that, Alberto Santos Dumont has largely been hidden by history, but his idea was that if everybody could have a vehicle where they could fly anywhere in the world, they'd probably get to know other people all over the world, and there'd be less reason for conflict and less reason for war, as those people would have already met people from other countries and be a lot less likely to engage in the kind of genocide we see time and time again these days, both in, obviously, and you don't need a history lesson on all the horrible, horrible things that have been perpetrated the last 100 years and the many, many people who have been killed. Largely because, it's us versus them, and I think that if you did get to know people from other countries, that whole mentality wouldn't really fly. You can't have an us versus them mentality when you've actually met the people, and they're good, honest, hardworking people, just like we are here in our country, or anybody is in their country. I mean, that's kind of the ridiculous part of war, is that you can't really have war for the most part without egregious ignorance, and that's what's going on right now, and it's being done for profit. It's being very obviously done for profit by numerous genocidal governments that I'm embarrassed to say I've paid taxes to in the last 20 years. But airships would be a way to avoid all of that, if you think about it. If you had an airship and you could just fly away, who would be in a war zone? Nobody would be in a war zone. They would just fly away. Even if you had no power in your airship and you were just relying on the wind, I mean, eventually you drift somewhere where the bullets aren't flying, hopefully. And especially in this age of the persecution of whistleblowers and people trying to do the right thing, like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning, if these kind of people had access to airships that they could live in comfortably and fly all over the world, how much better would their lives be? They probably wouldn't be locked up in a embassy in London or on the run through, communist Asia, or being held in a military brig, given a completely unfair trial in the case of Bradley Manning. They could just float away. I mean, they could whistle blow and float somewhere else. They could float indefinitely in their house. Another big part of my concept with airships actually is another thing Google's doing. I hate to bring up Google this week after they've been proven to be part of the NSA spy apparatus, the same way Yahoo and Microsoft and all the other big corporations are. If you want to hear my lecture about the evil of corporations, I'll do that some other time. But Google is also doing internet infrastructure based on balloons, which is very similar to one of the ideas I had about airships. And that's another great project for smaller scale airships, is you could set up a wireless mesh network without obstacles between them, and they could even rely on laser communication and other kind of communication that can be a lot more efficient over long distances, especially when there's no obstacles in the way, which is the case once you're up in the atmosphere a certain height. So, like Google, I wanted to do the same thing with the airships. My idea was that everybody's airship would also be a Wi-Fi hotspot as part of a mesh network, completely decentralized, person to person, completely encrypted and anonymous. So, I mean, it would be the end of censorship. It would be the end of the NSA spying that we see everybody engaged in today. I mean, Russia said they do the same thing there, and I'm sure they do, and China does the same thing, and the U.S. does the same thing. And that's another big motivator for airships. I mean, you could fly away from countries that do that kind of stuff. You could actually have anonymous communication and censorship-free communication. And the other part of the design is, even if you were in those countries with these airships, if they were designed properly, I think maybe you could keep that lack of censorship and keep your anonymity even while being in an oppressive regime like China or the Obama administration's oppressive regime that they've created. I think it would be, a gateway into true democracy, where the will of the people would have to be met by the government and the area they chose to reside, because they'd have a choice to reside. I mean, if you have basically a floating mobile home, which is the ultimate goal of my project, is to have a floating mobile home that can float anywhere in the world, and you're only buying goods and services where you happen to be, then I think that, the countries are going to be motivated to be a lot more open and democratic and engage in less kind of nefarious activities like the NSA and the CIA and all the Chinese and Russian equivalents are doing. So I think that's another big part of the goal is, you're creating an environment where the governments are unable to be as oppressive as they are right now. And so that's certainly part of the goal. So if there's corruption like there is now in this country, you'd be able to float away with your family and everybody you care about. And I think that's an important thing that our species should have, especially now with the technology we have that we don't have. And it's a really sad thing. And I think it's kind of a comment on the oppressive nature of our media outlets and our governments and the corporations that ultimately rule over both of those institutions. And it's a tragedy, and I aim to overturn it with technological means and open source means. I'd like to make sure that my designs are widely available for the public. All of my testing data is widely available for the public, as much as possible. Looking for volunteers as well as funding, obviously. And I actually have a few people on board. I've got a few other engineers, material scientists, electrical engineers, and I also have a few Java programmers that I'm familiar with that may be able to help me with this project. So this project's not starting from a total vacuum. We've also got all the history of airships and aeronautics to follow on, and I've watched every documentary I can find on airships and zeppelins. There's only about 20 that I've been able to find. I've watched them all. I've even watched all the fictional movies that have anything to do with airships or zeppelins, although obviously that kind of research is less helpful. And you want to go upstairs? All right, we'll go upstairs in a little bit, bud. So that's the other thing. I mean, most of this technological exists now. It's going to continue to exist. So at some point, this is inevitable. I mean, we've got to quit driving around, and we've got to start flying around. It's the natural progression of our evolution, and I feel we've been robbed of it for about the last 80 years by various political and economic forces, and I tend to end that. So the main purpose of this Indiegogo is actually just to buy a 3D printer, and I've almost made enough now to justify buying that 3D printer with the funds that I have gotten now from the Indiegogo and just funds I've been saving up on my own. So it's going to happen. But if I can get some more funds, I can get a better 3D printer. I can maybe pay for some of the equipment that is required to collect hydrogen and do some of the electronics soldering that I need to do and stuff like that. Although I have a soldering gun on a lot of that already, but I'm clearly going to need more equipment besides just a 3D printer. I'm going to need servos and batteries and some type of interface for the Android device to be able to control the physical aspect of the airship, like an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi or something like that. And that's it. So if you've got any ideas or any donations or any criticisms or comments, or you just want to check out this video of Everett rascaling around in the workshop, feel free to make a comment. And I'm going to do this with or without help, but it'd be nice to have help. So that's what this video is all about. Have a good night.